Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's truly an honor and a privilege to be here today to talk about what is my passion, which deals with forgiveness. Forgiveness is something I'm very, very passionate about, and I work in this whole area from the personal to the political. I've written about forgiveness, and I've gone to war zones and areas of conflict to help people heal from the wounds of war and conflict through the work of forgiveness. And my passion is to work with governments and civil societies. And most recently, actually, I've had the good fortune to be in Nigeria, and I've just come back from Nigeria. And Your Excellency, when you were speaking, it touched my heart so deeply. And some good news is that some of the work you described was exactly what I was doing in Nigeria. And I hope to go back in a few months there and also to Rwanda. Part of what I'll be doing is giving trainings in conflict resolution and also developing schools for forgiveness and reconciliation. And basically what the schools are about is training people to go through their own process of forgiveness and reconciliation so they can heal from the wounds of war and strife. And then they go back into their communities, and they are now able to continue this work and train others with all the materials. And later on, perhaps for those that are interested, I can talk more about that. Right now, what I would like to talk about is some of the thinking behind forgiveness as it applies to the healing of nations, because we can really set the stage within societies that will support the forces of forgiveness. As you all probably realize, forgiveness is a very, very complex process, and it takes place within our human minds, and yet it operates on many different levels. And so, in order for forgiveness to have an impact on a political level, there needs to be a political will. Forgiveness begins with the actions of leaders and the strengthening of structures which can teach the process of forgiveness. And part of the work I actually do is to help strengthen those structures and the educational component of that. Societies can help provide those structures which support the forces of forgiveness and which ultimately influences the way we think. This outer structure provides the mechanisms for large groups to come together to talk about the meaning of forgiveness and how they can see forgiveness within their own societies. Social and educational institutions can also provide a structure where people can come together to talk about how do they want to resolve their conflicts and to learn about forgiveness. And here again, I want to mention Nigeria, because Nigeria was so wonderful. In December, I led 3 different peace talks. One that was comprised solely of women, Christian and Muslim women coming together in dialogue. And they, in dialogue, talked about the things that were really deep in their hearts, where they finally had a vehicle to do this and came up with their peace process, what they wanted to do in their own communities. And then I worked with men and also with youth separately. And they've all come together to form their own organization and to support one another. So this work is happening, and I will be coming back to start the schools with them. Unfortunately, in our modern history, we've seen so much conflict and civil war and genocide leading to mass killings and mass murders and sufferings. And usually the people who survive these horrific situations have to rely on themselves amidst a great deal of loss, of anger, of fear, extreme hardship. And in spite of these unthinkable tragedies, many people do want to move forward in their lives, some wanting to forgive so they can have peace of mind and let go of the past, while others still find their time and look for the moments to seek revenge. In either case, people need to be healed and to be given understanding as to why groups of people find themselves sometimes in these horrific circumstances, how to prevent these circumstances from happening again, and how to help those who still remain live side by side, in some cases, with the perpetrators of the crime. This is the work of forgiveness. Centers, including such structures such as the Schools of Forgiveness and Reconciliation, can provide for those healings. And we've seen, as I mentioned, a little in Nigeria. I've done some of this work in Liberia, and soon, hopefully, I'll be going to Rwanda and Guinea to do this. And these programs focus on the healing of wounds of conflict and of mass murder, so these things cannot happen again. And for people to really understand what forgiveness is, what do we mean by forgiveness, and what does that look like? The process of how individuals forgive is very similar to the process of how groups also forgive. Yet we can predispose a society in supporting forces of forgiveness through a greater understanding of how we can activate what I call the forgiveness instinct within each one of us. There are 3 psychological conditions which activate the feelings of forgiveness between groups. The first psychological condition I call care-worthiness. People forgive transgressors who they view as appropriate targets, in a sense, to receive kindness and compassion. So the question becomes, how do you care for someone who might be a total stranger and who's done unimaginable harm? We need to recognize the pain in others and feel empathy. If you feel empathic or sympathetic or concerned for the transgressor, it is hard to maintain a vengeful attitude. Instead, forgiveness often emerges. Empathy seems to promote forgiveness in relationships between all sorts of people, including with groups who are in conflict with one another. When you feel empathic towards someone, your willingness to retaliate goes way down. Expected value is the second psychological condition for forgiveness. People forgive to the extent that they perceive that the relationship with the transgressor will be a valuable one. And I want to share a story of how this can manifest. And this deals with the Acholi people of northern Uganda, which illustrates the importance of expected value. For 2 decades, rebels calling themselves the Lord's Resistance Army fought to overturn the Ugandan government. To build support for their cause, they terrorized civilians. Thousands of preteen girls had been stolen from villages and given as wives to their rebel commanders, and thousands of other children had been captive and brainwashed and became the future child soldiers, trained to attack and kill people. And the villagers who resisted the rebels had their lips, nose, ears, breasts cut off to intimidate others to follow what they were told to do. What happened with the Acholi was that fear began to set in, and they decided that they wanted to institute an unorthodox practice of peacemaking. And what they did was that they welcomed back the rebels, the soldiers, back into the midst of their communities, offering forgiveness. Since the year 2000, there were popular radio programs that promised the rebels amnesty if they would just simply lay down their guns and return to the communities. The International Criminal Court in The Hague had resisted requests to drop its indictments, but the Ugandan government has officially offered amnesty to the rebels. And so when the rebels came home, sometimes in groups as large as 800 people, they participated in a traditional forgiveness ritual. And what that ritual was they first put their foot in a raw egg, which was symbolic of innocence and a new life. Then they stepped over a hoe or a farming tool to symbolize their intention to go back to a productive life in the community. And then as a final element of the ritual, they received a figurative cleansing by brushing against the leaves of a pobo tree whose slippery bark catches the dirt. After the ritual, the repentant rebel must sit down with a community leader and formulate plans for confessing their sins and compensating the families that they harmed, usually with livestock. When one of the victims spoke, they said, "What I'm after here is peace. If the people who did this to me and to us would only say they were sorry, we could take them back." And this is not too hard to understand why when people repent and attempt to compensate other victims. The LRA turned children against their own villages and their own tribes, but those children continued to have value to their family and to their community, even though they were brainwashed and intimidated into doing awful things. There's one problem here that we all face when we're doing this kind of work, and that is when somebody harms you, that harm itself drains some of the expected value from the relationship. And the Acholi children who were spirited away to join the LRA did horrific things to their own people. So now they are potential agents of harm. Therefore, despite the returning soldiers' implicit value to their parents and to their siblings and former neighbors, the Acholi had to reevaluate their relationship with them quite literally, and they had to reassess what kind of value they can expect in the future. It is not safe to simply assume that in the future interactions will be rewarding. But transgressions don't necessarily drain all of the expected value out of a relationship. Even if you harm me, I might continue to assign our relationship a high expected value if it was really of value to me up until now. This bodes well for our ability to forgive people who had really hurt us in the past. But what if your relationship with a transgressor had low expected value prior to the transgression? In such instances, endowing the relationship with some expected value afterwards is going to be an uphill climb. And this is why victims around the world tend to respond positively to compensation as an overture to forgiveness. Paying someone back for the harm you caused signals to the victim that your relationship has the potential to become rewarding again. The third psychological condition, and this is the last one, is perceived safety. We all need to feel safe, and especially in situations where there's been a genocide, civil war, any kind of unrest, we need to feel safe first. And people are more inclined to forgive a transgressor whom they perceive to be unwilling or unable to harm in the future. There are ways to evaluate safety. First, we try to understand why something happened in the first place, depending if it was unintentional. And when we think about some of the horrific things that have happened, even in some place like Rwanda, if we can understand that people it may have been unavoidable for some, or if the malicious, or if people really were put in situations where it's kill or be killed, it is easier to forgive them afterwards. The person who is personally pained by his or her actions demonstrating sympathy for the victim suffering and a desire to uphold the moral standards of the community are also easier to forgive because now you feel safe. Of these three conditions, perhaps the most difficult aspect of forgiveness impacting the healing of nations is to be able to develop empathy of the enemy, specifically because we want to dehumanize the enemy. In order to repair relationships, we have to change our perceptions and recognize the humanness in others. This necessitates a change in our own thinking, and this is what forgiveness can bring to us, because ultimately forgiveness is changing the way we think. It also necessitates a commitment to renew relationships. So I'd like to end by sharing with you a definition of forgiveness within a political context. Forgiveness within the context of politics includes a call for a collective turning from the past that neither overlooks justice nor reduces it to revenge, that insists on the humanity of enemies, even in their commission of dehumanizing deeds, and that values the justice that restores political community above the justice that destroys it. It is important to understand that forgiveness does not require the abandonment of punishment. It requires the abandonment of revenge. Pope Paul II reminds us that because we are human, our actions are colored by our fears and our perceptions. He cautions us by saying, because human justice is always fragile and imperfect, subject to the limitations and egoisms of individuals and groups, it must include and be complete by the forgiveness which heals and rebuilds troubled relationships from their foundations. In an address to a joint session of the United States Congress in 1990, former President of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, said that without a global revolution in the sphere of human consciousness, a more humane society will not emerge. Einstein also warned us that without a fundamental change in our thinking, humanity will drift towards catastrophe. You may be asking yourselves, what kind of radical change needs to happen in our thinking to stop the cycles of anger, hatred, and fear that fuel so many conflicts that we are witnessing today? It is the kind of thinking which helps you look beyond the outward behavior and to recognize that the true peacemakers are those who are not afraid to look within, to change the way we think, and heal the pain of the heart. Forgiveness supports this kind of transformation. We are on a threshold of a new stage of development, and if we are willing to do the hard work of forgiveness and recognize what a powerful agent forgiveness is, then it is possible to create a more loving and peaceful world. The results of this will be dramatic. With all the violence which has taken center stage on the world arena, we can either take a path of self-destruction or a path leading to a radical transformation. Forgiveness is pivotal in creating the kind of transformation which will not only bring peace in our lives, but will bring peace in the world. Thank you.